over in the UK with literature about food loss and waste. Very, very, very minimal stuff here in the US. And if it was US, it was very targeted. So I had to get really creative what we were finding on our peer-reviewed journals. And also, some other white papers and USDA data. And if you guys know with the USDA data, there are gaps, right? Because if the producer is not giving over the information, they don't, it's not being, digitized. So then once we got done with that, we said, well, let's do a really, really, really quick, it was a few months, where we actually did the interviews. I called up awesome people like Natural Upcycling in the back of the room and said, can you help us with this project? I called up, as who's walking in the room, North American Rendering Association. I called up dairy farmers that I knew, beef farmers that I knew. I called up packing plants. I called up, and these literally were just like cold calls, and they didn't have a lot of time to pull in true data. It was, hey, we need to get this done. We have 60 days to do this interview, to do these, to do this survey and these interviews. Help us. And that's how we started to get this information out. So again, that's, we would love to do even more of a deeper dive, because what we did find is that we broke it down. We went from on-farm to transport to slaughter, aka harvest, okay? We stopped when the beef side, is this my little, nope, how do I go back? Nope, sorry guys. I thought there would be a little thingy here. We stopped at slaughter in the beef. We did not want to go to the processing side. That's a whole nother story. And we've already got data on that. We wanted to then go to when the animal became food. Okay? So we found out that on farm, the losses are mortality, whether that's calves to adults. And what we're calling mortality is if that animal did not get to her intended use, right? Or his intended use. If they died at, 2 pounds or 2 days prior to slaughter, that was considered mortality. Okay, if it didn't get to their intended use. Biggest thing was these delayed culling decisions. We found that more on the dairy side. But again, all dairy cattle go to what? Beef. Okay, so this adds in the piece of the dairy side of this. And then we also have a lot of animals going into the system in compromised conditions. So they're not making it off the truck. Okay, so then when they're not making it off the truck and we get into transport and slaughter, they actually now have to sit there and say, well, we lost the animal. The farmer didn't lose the animal. We did down the line. Okay? So we found in the transport side, because we called up trucking companies as well, and we found that though they have a low percentage of loss on the trailers and during transport, there was a high impact because, again, they're losing the whole animal. Because if they die on that trailer, right, they can't go anywhere. They actually have to then go to landfill because they don't know what they died from. We know that there's bruising happening on the transport and on the trucks, and we also know that shrink, right? Shrink is definitely inevitable. But those are issues that we are seeing because, or actually you can't see shrink and you can't see bruising. You can't see that until the hide is off. So if they're being jostled around in their transport, you're going to get bruised. Right? If you have too many animals or too less of animals, they actually can get bruised up.
What does shrink mean in the context of transporting cattle?
Great question. That's their loss of any urine, feces, like sweating out, anything of losing that, what's that called, like the liquids.
Okay, losing mass.
Mass, thank you. Sometimes my words don't always come to me. And then when we come to slaughter, is again, we don't know about these bruising until we've got that hide off, right? And if you've ever known when you're pulling that hide off, some of those bruises might be very superficial. Some of it might be superficial until you start to actually go in and then it's massive bruising inside. And bruising can't go anywhere. That has to go to landfill. It can't go to pet food anymore, right, Ken? The bruising can't go to pet food. Goes to you guys? Okay. We also have here in this wonderful United States is rejection. From, if that carcass looks funny in any bit, whether it's got antibiotic residue, any nodes that they think is going to be TB or anything like that, they will reject the whole carcass, not just pieces of the carcass. The whole carcass is gone. Okay. I know I'm getting close on time. I want to get my panel up here. So the biggest thing is that where we have been looking at it is that producers and haulers are not receiving feedback. They're not receiving feedback from the plants. So when the slaughterhouse is showing bruising on carcasses, they just don't, it stops there. They just trim it and it doesn't go back because we don't know, is it happening on farm or is it happening in trucking? They don't know how much trim is actually happening, and they're limited to be incentivized. Okay? Now when it comes to the plants, they're not quantified by weight, meaning when I ask the slaughterhouses, like, how much trim, like how much bruising, they're like, I don't know, like a bucket or whatever a day. It's not per carcass, right? Because again, time equals money for them, so they're not actually saying, okay, each carcass is losing this amount of, like, for trim or bruising. And it's also, they don't have, the best way to explain it is like, it's not standardized, right? Again, they only sit there and say how many carcasses were rejected. That's what they have to denote. So when it comes to industry-wide is, we don't have the metrics, they're not standardized. A lot of them, the best part is every plant that we talk to, they collect the data, but it just sits in their folder. Because they don't have to report it. And it's not mass-based, it's event-based. Again, so they talk about losing the carcasses, but they don't actually talk about how much weight that carcass was. They don't actually sit there and say, okay, the animal came in, it was 1,200 or 1,300 pounds. When it was a hot carcass weight, it was this amount, and that's what we lost. They just say, we lost 1, 2, 5, okay? And again, this barriers to data sharing. Slaughter side does not discuss with the trucker or the producer unless there has been an issue over and over and over. If it's only a couple times that happens, they're not going to tell them. So that's one of our issues. So real quick, because I know I'm at time. So we found in our project is 4 things that we could figure out like very quickly that could be done tomorrow and today is work on this fitness for transport. Not allowing compromised animals on the truck. Okay? If she or he cannot be fit for transport, see if we can hold them a little longer. Most of them can't be held, but they probably shouldn't, or ask them to go on a smaller truck to get to harvest. Maybe not put them in the most, in the big pot load and have too many animals surrounding them where they're going to go down and then she does not be or he does not become food. Another is, again, goes hand in hand, is earlier culling, right? And so if like if the dairy animals at the end of life or mama cows at the end of her production life, is cull them a little earlier instead of pushing them out to the last possible minute of where then she becomes a compromised fitness for transport. Working on these plant for producer feedbacks, making these loops a little bit better. We know that when a producer uses a smaller packing plant, where they maybe only kill 2 head a day, there is that conversation loop because they're only seeing a couple head, whether it's pigs, beef, lambs, they can have that conversation. But when you're working with the big packers and they're literally harvesting 200 in an hour, that's a total different story, okay? And then again, let's come up with this mass-based measurement. Instead of having it as numbers lost, let's have it as weight loss. Okay, I think that was, okay. So again, real quick going through that, but if you have any questions, Minnie and I are here to have that conversation. The full page, full white paper is available on the ReFeds website, but we can obviously send it to you. We're also working on what we're calling industry briefs. They should be out here in the next couple of weeks. We wanted to break it down because 32 pages, I don't know if anybody's going to read the 32-page document, Kent. But we want to make sure that you guys actually have access to what pretty much I just talked about so that we can make that change, that we can make, these changes into this, the beef system. But we also we have a dairy side too of this project. But this is the beef discussion, not the dairy discussion. So with that, I'd love to bring my 2 panelists up with me. And I would love for them to introduce themselves. So my job is to introduce them first. 2 minutes of just who they are. You do have their bios on the app. So I just was not going to waste that time. I'd rather talk with all of you instead of reading their bios. But Charles, I'll lead it over to you to have a little quick introduction.
Charles Brook. I am the program director for livestock enteric methane mitigation at an organization called Spark Climate Solutions. Spark is a nonprofit that helps accelerate the development of underserved fields of climate intervention. We've largely focused on super pollutants, so short-lived climate pollutants such as methane, but also long-term strong pollutants like nitrous oxide as well. My background, I'm a microbiologist by training. My background is also in food production specifically. I spent quite some time working in a USDA inspected harvesting and processing facility, working in food pathogen detection, safety and quality. And before this role now, I was the lead scientist for the California Department of Food and Agriculture's livestock methane programs. So spent quite some time working on the dairy digester research and development program for California, which has built probably more digesters than any program globally, and then also built the enteric methane research program for the state, and also serve on the science oversight committee for the Global Methane Hub's Enteric Fermentation Accelerator, which is a research grant program to develop these types of technologies to reduce methane from animals. So it's me.
Thank you. And Jefferson?
Good morning, everybody. Hey, Jefferson Lorenzo here, assistant professor at the Animal and Dairy Science Department at the University of Georgia. I am originally from Brazil, but have been in the US for a couple of years. So I want to point that I am from Brazil because if you don't catch my accent, if I say something that you don't understand, please raise your hand. I'll be happy to repeat. But that might happen the other way around. If you speak too fast, I may say, hey, can you repeat that? So I became a professor, assistant professor now, going for tenure soon, at the University of Georgia in 2021. And I've been spending most of my time investigating the topic of feed efficiency in beef cattle, mainly from the lenses of using microbiome information, the information about the microorganisms that live in their gastrointestinal tract and how those microorganisms affect methane production and feed efficiency. And it turns out that the two things are correlated, as you will see.
Perfect. And I'm going to turn it over to Charles for a quick little bit of his slides, and then ask you a couple questions.
So a few weeks ago, I put this deck together for San Francisco Climate Week, so that's why it says San Francisco Climate Week. But the context is the same. So really, when we look at the projection, and our goal is to be able to ensure that Earth is on a trajectory for a stable climate. And when we look at livestock production in general, we're on track. Right now, we have about 1.5 billion large ruminants that are managed by humans. And that's looking to increase quite significantly come to the end of the century. And by 2100, livestock enteric methane, so just cattle eructations, burps from large ruminants, is going to make up about 1/4 degree Celsius of warming by the end of the century. It's a significant contribution, and really this is based on projections of managing animals at the intensity and efficiency that we do today, and just expanding to the number that we're going to need to feed the number of people that are going to be on the planet. So this also means that we have a great opportunity to improve the efficiencies of the production of these animals to mitigate those projections in the future as well. But when we look at, people really don't understand how much of the methane emissions, anthropogenic methane emissions today are driven by our livestock population. And right now, 30% of all the global warming that we feel is driven by methane. And livestock enteric methane is about 27% of that. 5% of that is manure management. But when you look at how we're financing this space and how we're allocating capital to the space, livestock enteric methane receives about 2% of all the methane finance in the space, and methane finance receives about 1% of all the climate finance in the space. And you'll see the kind of disparity when you look at manure to energy receives more than half of that, but makes up less than 5% of those emissions. I will say I think I'm largely responsible for some of that in California. But So we've been looking at different approaches to addressing enteric methane specifically. And last year we did a large effort at Spark to evaluate all the different technologies that have been available or could become available in the near future. Feed additives, these are chemical compounds that inhibit methanogenesis. So methane is produced by organisms, archaea, in the gut of cows. Archaea are some of the oldest organisms on the planet, disrupting them specifically so they cannot create methane. Some plant bioactives, things that have tannins, oils, essential oils, things that either are not methanogenic, so don't feed into the methanogenesis process. Diet management, more efficient diets. You can create feed that is more digestible, easier for the animal to digest, produces less methane. Some probiotics have demonstrated some improved efficiency. You can select animals genetically for lower methane emissions. So we can measure animals. There's really great separation between different groups of animals. And if you identify a high-performing animal, just as productive as another animal, but it may have 30% lower methane emissions, and we can select for that. And that is a permanent, cumulative action that we could take in those. And then even vaccines are being explored for the reduction of enteric methane as well, and still really in early stages. These are among a few of the categories in the space. But when you look at where methane emissions, enteric methane emissions are coming from, the reality is they're all over the place. And the solutions, we need a variety of different solutions because the variety of systems that these emissions stem from, these are in almost nearly every country on Earth relies on ruminants. Because ruminants can take things that we can't eat and turn them into things that we can eat. And humans as a species have relied on that ability for as long as we've been around and as long as ruminants have been around. And so this is really demonstrating, yeah, there's some big pockets of methane emissions, large cattle populations, Brazil, India, US, but the reality is they're everywhere. And the systems that they're produced in, whether that be a feedlot operation where you might have access to that animal every day, you might be able to mix and formulate its feed, but most of the emissions are actually from animals that are out on pasture that we don't have access to every day. So how do we generate innovation to be able to access those animals? And that's really the struggle because that's most of the animals on the planet, that's most of the emissions in the profile as well. And most people don't recognize this, but an animal out on pasture, a cow out on pasture, she's gonna make about 3 tons of CO2 equivalent methane, enteric methane per year. An animal on a feedlot, we're gonna make about 1 ton. And that's just a change in diet. That's a change in diet and efficiency. And so it's a pretty large discrepancy. We often get, feedlots often get beat over the head. But those animals on a per ton basis, per animal head basis, are generally a lot more efficient when it comes to emissions. And so we did looked at all these technologies and we looked at what needed to be true for a target product to be developed to be able to address this. What do we had to address? We needed consumer acceptance. We needed strong mitigation potential. It needed to work in pasture. Hopefully it didn't have any upstream or downstream effect. Ideally, it'd have a positive productivity impact, a reason for the farmer to want to adopt this. And that dials into cost feasibility, right? This thing can't cost the world because we're operating on pretty thin margins. And then ideally, this thing's going to be available by 2030 when some of these commits will come out. So there's a barcode on there as well if you want to look at the full roadmap on it. But that's just kind of set the stage for where emissions come from, how they're broken down, and some of the technologies that we have to address them today, at least on pasture.
Thank you.
All right. I have 3 slides to share with y'all this morning. The green button. Thank you. So this first one is just like data we collected in a relatively large study involving 1,200 Angus bulls across the United States. We went to 7 different states to collect those samples. And it turns out that the point that I want to make on this slide is that there's a huge variation in the amount of dry matter they consume every day. Dry matter intake, for those not familiar, is the feed minus the moisture. So it's just the dry matter content of the diet. And it turns out that in this particular study, we saw an average of 22 pounds of dry matter consumption per day per bull. But notice that some animals ate as little as 9.7 pounds per day, whereas others ate 38 pounds, 38.1 pounds per day. So huge variation. And many factors affect these variation in dry matter intake, but I would argue that more importantly, many factors affect feed conversion efficiency, or the amount of how many pounds of feed we feed every day for an animal to gain 1 pound of body weight gain. That is maybe the million-dollar question. And I kind of addressed that on this slide. Feed conversion efficiency can be measured in many different ways. And one of them is what I'm showing on this slide right here. It's called RFI, or residual feed intake. For those of you not familiar, we have this regression line here shown in black. And this regression line is calculated based on the animal's body weight and level of gain. So for a given body size or metabolic body weight, actually, we convert the body weight into metabolic body weight and their level of gain, their average daily gain, we can predict how much an animal should eat. So it's represented by that black line there. If an animal consumes more or above that line, that animal is considered inefficient. He's high RFI because he's consuming more than the regression predicted. On the other hand, if an animal consumes less than the regression predicted, shown by the green dot there, that animal is feed efficient because he's consuming less than the regression line predicted. That's just one widely accepted way of measuring feed efficiency. And it turns out that when you measure feed efficiency using residual feed intake, not only you remove variation due to different animal performance and body size, but actually it's many studies have been shown residual feed intake to be correlated with methane production, which is kind of what I try to address in this next slide here, and it's my last one. I only have 3. In this study here, we collected ruminal samples from animals at the beginning and at the end of the feedlot period. For those of you not familiar, and I'm sorry, I understand some people said, I know nothing about cattle, so I don't want to insult y'all's intelligence. There's a feedlot operator here. But rumen, what is the rumen? So the forestomach of a cow or a ruminant is subdivided into 4 chambers, and the largest one is the rumen. So we sample the contents of the rumen, the large portion of their stomach, at the beginning and at the end of the feedlot, and we did microbiome analysis. And on panel B here, you have the summary of what happened in the most efficient animals, the low RFI, the ones that consume less than predicted. And it turns out that they maintained fairly constant population of Methanobrevibacter in their rumen throughout the feedlot period. And you can figure out just by the name, Methanobrevibacter, this is a genus of methanogenic archaea that produces methane. On the other hand, panel A shows what happened in the rumen of the inefficient animals, the high RFI animals. And notice that there was a significant increase in the population of Methanobrevibacter in the rumen of those animals. And that actually explained why they were less efficient, because they were producing more methane. They developed a greater population of Methanobrevibacter and Methanosphaera as well, and some others which are not shown here. I tried to just summarize the contents. And it turns out that from the animal nutrition perspective, methane production is a waste of energy. So every time an animal burps methane, eructates methane, it's eructating calories, okay? It's losing energy. And that loss of energy can be as high as 12% of the total gross energy intake that an animal consumes. So that can represent a lot of, can explain a lot of why some animals are efficient and others are not, just the population that they develop in the rumen.
Thank you. All right. You guys can hear me okay? I'm used to shouting. I'm just a very loud person. So I'm going to do a couple of just panel questions, but again, if you have anything that you really want to, please raise your hand, because we will open it up for questions. But my first question for the two of you is, what, for both of your systems, what does it have to do with food loss and waste? Like, how do you, put that together? So Charles, bring me back together of how does it work with food loss and waste?
Yeah, I think, across the board, the more efficient an animal can be before it gets to the consumer, the less emissions that it's going to experience when it's actually on the plate. When it comes to loss, there is, people don't really recognize how many animals don't make it to the end, actually to that plate. And, we might think about some of the small producers that make up the majority of the beef supply here in the U.S. I think the average beef cow-calf operation here in the U.S. is like 50 head. But globally, and then, they might lose one animal a season, and, it's kind of a write-off. But globally, more than 20% of animals never make it to their end product. That's an enormous loss, and that's morbidity, mortality, and animal health has a tremendous component in that, and that never stops. That's in the lowest socioeconomic strata that are raising these animals. We have the opportunity to improve things like that, and it's also recognized that depending on the system that you're in, you're going to have different interventions. The things that I talked about, feed additives, different types of feeds, vaccines, genetics, things like that, there's a time and place when you add those things in. And it's not for a two cow, smallholder farmer in India that's trying to feed their family. That's not when you add those things. You need to focus on the basics. That animal needs food, that animal needs to be needs to be taken care of, needs health parameters taken care of it. And then you can start thinking about genetics, then you can start adding these things in. And so I think across the board, it's really about, are we doing the best that we can for the context that we're in? And that's going to vary case by case. And having that set standard of good practice gives you such a strong ability to reduce that waste. And those are where the good practices and the structures that we've built, things like beef checkoff, educating people about how they should be raising their animals, really ties into it, and it goes all the way through. And I believe there's going to be a time where we're managing emissions in these types of education programs, just like we've been managing quality. And I think one of my favorite examples of connecting from the processing center down to the education, down to the producer, is when the beef checkoff took on the role of making sure people were vaccinating their animals correctly. When I was breaking beef, when you're starting out, they say you get to trim the neck. Because if you ever broke beef, neck's the hardest part to trim. It's really hard to get all the meat off of there. And so we started educating people that actually, when you're looking at loss on the processing floor, you should inject that animal in the neck. That's where you should deliver it, because that's, if you're going to get any waste there, that's really what's going to be. If you have a injection site reaction, anything like that, versus you put it in the hindquarter, you're taking off, you're trimming off good product. And so simple decisions like that people can change practice in, really implement quickly, it's going to save them process time, it's going to save them capital and get more return on their product. Things like that really make a difference. But that, to your earlier point, that means that the processor needs to be talking to the producer. And I think infrastructure like that, like the checkoff and education programs like that, that's what they need to be doing, and we need to lean into them a little bit harder.
In Jefferson.
Well, I agree 100%. And even the ones that make it to let's say to the feedlot, which is the finishing phase, by what I showed here, to be consistent with my own message, even those that we are finishing, they are healthy animals, they are about to become food in 6 months or so of feedlot. If we consider just the topic of feed efficiency by itself, a general diet in the U.S. has 65% corn in its composition on a dry matter basis. If you do that, and if you assume that an animal with good feed conversion will require 5.5 pounds a day to gain 5.5 pounds of feed to gain a pound of body weight gain, and an inefficient will need 7.5-ish. That difference over the time of the feedlot period represents over a ton of feed that is wasted if an animal, comparing an animal that is efficient versus one that is inefficient. Now, converting back to the amount of corn, which is 65% of the diet, you're talking about 970-ish pounds of corn. And if you consider that the U.S. finishes 26 million heads of cattle in the feedlot every year, I did the math a few weeks ago, and I think it came down to 26.5 billion pounds of corn can be saved. We would have the exact same amount of beef in the market if in this theoretical scenario that I'm constructing here, if we feed efficient animals versus inefficient animals, we will have the meat on the market, but we will have saved 26.5 billion pounds of corn, which could be used for human consumption, to feed pigs, to feed chicken, for other uses. So that is efficient as well. To produce this corn, it takes a lot of resources, it takes land, it generates greenhouse gas emissions and blah, blah, blah. So if we could be more efficient, that results in a better efficiency of the whole system as well.
Thank you. And it kind of goes back to the project that ReFed and WWF worked on, is, our conclusion was we don't consider those animals as food until they're harvested. But when we lose them upstream, where do those emissions go? Where did all the feed that was fed them? Because now they just go to a landfill or somewhere, and all of a sudden it's just lost. And that was why it was super important for us to kind of look at it, is because it doesn't actually get to the consumer now. And so you guys as consumers don't get to actually, have that beautiful steak or that awesome burger. And so, that was important to us of why we decided to go that way. Because again, when we're talking about emissions and we're putting feed into them and we're putting even labor, we haven't even talked about labor, right? But all of that going into raising these animals, if they don't get to your plate, what did we do it for? So, you guys keep answering a lot of my questions, I've got beautiful questions here. But let's go, Charles, real quick on this one. You're also a producer by trade. When, big corporate comes down and says, this is we need to change things. What can we do as industry or as, a Google or somebody else in the room? What can they do to work better with the producer instead of saying you have to do this? What could they do to work better with you?
Yeah, this is kind of a difficult piece in beef. I've also worked a lot with the dairy industry. You have large dairy producers selling directly to large corporates, Danone, Nestle, Starbucks, and these large endpoints of the supply chain. They can incentivize their supply chain, right? They could say, we'd like you to adopt this practice. We'd willing to give you X amount of dollars to be able to do this, to take on the cost of doing this, so we can reduce our emissions in our supply chain, right? They have that ability to do that. I think that ability exists in the beef supply chain, but we don't see it as well because the beef supply chain's broken up into a lot more pieces. We got cow-calf, usually get into a backgrounding if it's needed, or into the feedlot, then feedlot into the processor, and processor to the retailer. And so unless there's the ambition at the end of that chain, and they're willing to stitch the value all the way down to the producer and the different aspects of the producer, you're not going to really see change. You're not going to see. It's really, it's like pushing on a sponge, right? It's just going to take it in, it's going to absorb it, and you can't really make the impact that you want. And unless we see a big signal that says, if I do this, there is a durable market out there that I'm going to be able to bet on when I raise these animals next season or the season after that it's willing for me to change my practice. And right now in the beef sector, we don't see that. We don't have it. And I think that's probably one of the most important things we could see from the retail side, from the end user supply chain, is to generate that durable market signal, and say either via aggregated demand, and saying we're willing to pay X amount for X amount of tons that are produced this way. And if you do this, we'll commit to it at this premium price, because someone's got to pay for it. Now, what producers are always also worried about is down the line, when past 2030, say, when corporate commitments, or you've met them or you haven't, and maybe the fires dwindle down a little bit, are the procurement standards going to stick around? and it is the producer going to have to eat it, right? Is that just the cost of doing business now? And I'll tell you what, the margins aren't that big. Well, in beef, they're a little bit bigger now, but that's just because of the supply issue. But, in dairy, especially, the cost, the margins are just not great. And so you can't take on the cost of, dumping in an additive. Right now, an additive in the dairy sector, 3-nitroxypropanol, also called Bovaer, reduces enteric methane emissions about 30%. And that 30% is about 1 ton of CO2 equivalent. It costs, in order to get it on farm, use it for a year, it's about $130. Well, if you look in the USDA's average gross revenue for a dairy cow over operating, gross profits over operating costs for a dairy cow, it's about $100. So, if that subsidy goes away or that incentive goes away, well, you're out of business. So, it's real numbers. And so if we want the change to happen, we have to be willing to pay for it. You need the signal, and if you have the signal, you get the innovation and you get the practice change. But it's got to be serious and it's got to be durable.
Thank you. And Jefferson, because I want to open up the floor, so you get the final question. Okay, I have a magic wand and I have billions of dollars. Okay, billions. Yes. So if we were to wave our magic wand today, what is one project or one gap that you want to close? What would it be?
Wow. That is a tough one. Well, I'll start with one small step that we're currently working on in my lab, and it is in line with what Charles just said about the cost of 3-NOP. I don't know if you all are aware of that, but in the US, there's only one product currently approved for specific use of reducing enteric methane emission in cattle, and it's Bovaer, 3-NOP, 3-nitrooxypropanol. But that product is only approved to be used in the dairy industry at the moment. It's not approved to be used in beef cattle. So we need that. We need alternatives to that. And my lab is currently working on something that is promising. It fits into a big picture. Let me explain. We are going to farms and collecting number 2 blueberries, number 2 onions, the ones that are perfect, but they don't look good, so producers cannot sell them at prime price. So we get that produced, and we do a controlled fermentation, and we generate medium-chain fatty acids. Medium-chain fatty acids are rich in energy. They're energy dense. They have lots of calories per gram, and by producing them, we are producing a cheap source of calories, or an affordable source of calories that cattle producers can use. And in our lab tests, results have shown that it reduces methane production by 22%. Like Charles said, Bovaer, the commercial product that is out there, reduces anywhere between 20 and 30% methane production. Our product in this preliminary test is shown to reduce 22%. So if I had $1 billion, I would continue investigating this product across multiple species, beef, dairy, because I see that as a lot of promising feed additive, because it's going to be cheaper than Bovaer, I think, because it's produced by fermentation, which is a cheap process, and by fermentation of produced that is basically not the prime that producers have out there. So I think this is a good starting point.
Well, we'll go find you a couple billion. How's that? All right. So we're coming up at the end of our session, and I'd love to open it up to the floor. So please, yes.
Sorry, mostly for Charles, I think. So you brought up that the methane emissions from a pastured cow are higher than one of a feedlot cow, but you didn't touch on the way the pasture is managed. And I wonder if that has come into your research or your focus, what the possible offsets, or, in my opinion, like massive return on investment could be from a well-managed pasture in that situation.
Yeah, I mean, pasture management, it's interesting. You think about like adaptive multi-paddock grazing, moving animals around on the land, and it's real interesting because it feels like people think it's new here in the U.S., but that's standard practice in like New Zealand, Australia, places that have, that rely on grazing animals, Ireland, Scotland. And it's really just a matter of managing your natural resources, the forage that you have available to you. Granted, it depends on what types of land you're working on. If you're working on marginal land, well, you got to get by with what you can get by on. So yeah, is there an opportunity to manage your animals in a way and so that you're stimulating more biodiversity? Are you depositing more carbon? Integrating the animals back on the landscape? Absolutely. The fundamental is when we have those animals on pasture, that cow's on pasture, she's bigger. Her job is to make slaughter stock. She's gonna bring us the next tranche of animals. So she's bigger, she eats more, she makes more methane. Right, and it's really just I can tell you with about 80% confidence how much methane the animal's gonna eat by their dry matter intake. You saw that line, and that's a pretty good regression. And so, that's kind of the basis of it. She's gonna be on that pasture for years. And so every year she's gonna be eating that much, and we don't get to, enjoy her bounty until several years later. And so she's just stockpiling those emissions embedded in that. But that's also matriculating down in those animals that she's birthing. And so those are going to get into the feedlot faster. Once they're on that feedlot feed, much more energy dense, higher concentration, less forage, less methane production. You're putting on body mass much quicker. And that's the fundamental piece of it. I'm not saying that, again, I think animals, especially ruminants, have a job on pasture. That's why they're part of the human system, is to convert that forage into things that we can eat, because we can't eat lignocellulose and they can. And we want to take advantage of that. We want to do it the best way we can. So there's actually some great projects now, things called like time to graze. Satellite emissions, looking at the maturity of forage on pasture, when to move your animals to different areas. C3 grasses are more digestible than C4 grasses. So if you get them earlier, younger sward, you can reduce emissions that way too, more energy available for the animal. All those things are very practical. Those are all part of a good grazing management plan too. And it's kind of abysmal, the number of ranchers that have a grazing management plan. And so it all starts on that fundamental piece. So getting people up to that basic level so they can start to add practices on is still where we're at. And I think people, because we're in the U.S., think we're a lot farther along than we are. We still got a lot of work to do.
Thank you. Minnie's got it. Oh, back there.
I was going to follow up.
Yeah.
My calculation on the metric tons of CO2 is about 2.8 annually, so I was glad to see you were 3. Following up on what this lady is saying, I'm going to ask you this question. What do you calculate grass sequestration on healthy native grasses per acre per year? I want to give her an answer
Yeah.
to the ratio. And the other thing is, I come from Falls County, Texas. It's the #1 county, cow county in central Texas. I know of none of my neighbors that do not have a well-managed pasture plan, or they're not in business anymore. We lost them 2 years ago with the drought. Because I have a number you would expect on pasture grasses, I'd like to hear yours.
And to be fair, it says we're going to convert methane into CO2, depending on what conversion factor you want to use and what you're going to sequester, and then the timeline for sequestration in the soil. And so it depends largely on what type of soil you're on. And so, on I guess for a hectare base, I'd go for 0.2 to 0.4 tons per hectare per annum.
Healthy native pasture grasses, 1 to 3 tons per year. If your cow is generating 3, you can start doing how many acres of grass you need to take care of that animal. Okay? And USDA brings people to our ranch all the time.
I'm in Dallas, up and down.
Thank you. And we have time for one more question. Right
Since I was
here.
mentioned,
Yeah, so I called you out.
I'm gonna take the bait. On the topic of the durable market signals, I just want to pull on that thread a little bit because, so where I sit in the supply chain is I'm on the client side. We partner with food service companies like Compass, who are purchasing products from distributors like Cisco, who are coming from, everybody knows here, the further chain. So how would we, all the way down where I sit in the supply chain, know that the beef that's been raised has a specific management practice that reduces emissions by X?
Great question.
Because I would
And-
love to, like, yes, we could, but like, if there's no,
Yeah, you need the traceability, and because we're trading, and it's a little bit better in the U.S. We have some traceability tracking for how we're moving animals, and depending on what country you're in, there are tags and individual animal tracking systems where they're moving through it. There's a lot of countries that doesn't exist, right? Spot cattle markets, you don't know which where an animal was raised, how it was raised, and all. But that's also part of the efforts we're seeing now to try to make sure we can valorize the supply chain, so ranchers can get rewarded for the practices that they're implementing on farm, and that's been the hard part. I think that's one of the reasons why we haven't seen a lot of a good encouragement from the supply chain, is because how am I going to account for it, right? If I'm going to pay for it, I want to be able to write it in my books with some confidence without getting raked over the coals by some newspaper that says I'm greenwashing this or that. I want to have confidence that what I'm incentivizing, I'm getting.
and we want to know if we're paying a little bit more, that there's actual value embedded in the product that we're buying.
Absolutely. And so that metric piece, whether that's through a insetting-based carbon market system or just direct engagement with your supply chain, saying, I want to buy products for this, and it's with the consolidation for the packers and processors, you might have to go through a couple of them first, and they might not like it. But it's also an opportunity to work directly with your ranchers.
Well, we are at time, and I know that I think there's snacks waiting for us. I don't know if it's a break or next session. But I really wanted to thank my two panelists here. Thank you guys so much for your time today. And I think they've got a little bit of time if anybody wants to say, and if there was questions out in the audience that you didn't get asked. But again, thank you all for coming to our session. I know we could speak. I know I could talk beef all day, and I know these two can too. So thank you all for joining us today.